Hello. We are going to read some of Culting of America because why not? I just got done, I think, with editing it, which means I need to give it a whole read through and make sure it's okay. And I always like to rush straight to the socials with my things as I've written them. So I've just finished editing, like my second round through, chapter 5 of Culting of America, which is all about isolation. So now I have to do like this whole read through. So I'm just going to read some of it. And I'm probably not going to be answering that many questions. Glad everyone likes this outfit. It's the one I just made. And kind of looks like a Alice in Wonderland playing card, I feel like. All right. Chapter 5. Isolation from the world. The no contact order. This chapter is 36 pages, so we certainly won't get through the whole thing. And also, it needs to be 20 pages. So certainly my editor is going to make it much better. There was a man who lived for the pursuit of happiness. He drew his inspiration from the rave culture mantra of peace, love, unity, and respect. Plur. A philosophy that fueled his days at Burning Man, where he found a sense of utopian community that mirrored his idealistic aspirations. In business, his methods were anything but conventional. He conducted interviews in bars or on party buses, choosing employees based on how much fun they were to have a drink with. It was a little wild, a little eccentric, but somehow it worked. He built multiple successful ventures, even selling one for a jaw-dropping $265 million, and eventually became synonymous with a company that wasn't just about shoes. It was about happiness. In 2012, he turned his sights to an ambitious $350 million urban renewal project in downtown Las Vegas. He envisioned a thriving hub for entrepreneurs and creatives, built on the ideals of connectedness, co-learning, and spontaneous interactions. He called it the Downtown Project, and it was a living experiment in community and innovation. People lived in upgraded shipping containers, shared workspaces, and blurred the lines between professional and personal life, all in the name of creativity. But this dream of constant engagement and relentless collaboration came with a darker side. The pressure to conform, the insularity of the community, and the erosion of personal boundaries all took their toll. Cut off from the outside world and their own support systems, residents and employees faced burnout, isolation, and worsening mental health, while being kept as busy as possible, or at least prevented from spending much of their time alone. Tragically, a string of suicides among project members shattered the utopian vision. When Tony Shay died in 2020, under mysterious circumstances, it cast a long shadow over his legacy. Zappos wasn't just about selling shoes, and the Downtown Project wasn't just about urban renewal. They were experiments in happiness. But in the end, they left a haunting question. What's the true cost of chasing utopia? Isolation, or sometimes insulation, from the outside world is crucial to high control environments. As the International Cult Awareness Organization puts it, cults often encourage members to cut ties with the outside world. This isolation and controlled socialization leaves members more susceptible to the cult's influence. Whether it's relocating people to some commune in the middle of nowhere, setting up strict rules about who you can talk to, or creating boundaries that make it impossible to keep up with friends and family, the goal is the same: severing members from their old lives and support systems. Once that's done, the group builds a little bubble where their ideology can thrive, untouched by the outside perspectives. When you're cut off from the world, you're surrounded 24/7 by the group's beliefs and messages, with almost no chance to hear anything else. That constant reinforcement starts to feel like reality. It's not long before questioning things seems impossible. Margaret Singer explains how this plays out in cults. Recruits are brought to camps in the country, weekend retreats, clandestine cult facilities, workshops in the desert, and a host of other places to isolate them from access to their usual social life. These groups know that physically cutting off people is an effective way to change their behavior and make them more compliant. When you're suddenly removed from everything familiar, your friends, your family, job, school, it becomes so much easier to fall in line with the group's expectations. Physical isolation isn't just a logistical move, it's psychological. Dr. Alexandra Stein tells us that the combination of fear and isolation is what puts the coercion into coercive persuasion. It's about creating an environment where the group's ideas go unchallenged, and you're left with no one to remind you who you were before. Janja Lalich tells us that after living in an environment where everyone thinks and acts alike, even if you are not as sequestered as those in more restrictive cults, your outlook shrinks and your ability to communicate atrophies. Hang on. I used that at the bottom too. Okay, just take that out at the bottom. The cult I grew up in was like that. Complete physical and psychological isolation. 10,000 strong who lived in communes scattered around the globe, and everyone devoted absolutely every part of their lives to the cult, completely cutting out anyone who wasn't willing to pay the same entrance costs they did. Military training camps do it too. I wrote a book about that. You can get signed copies attached. Isolating recruits to build loyalty and cohesion. The U.S. Army is all about using isolation in basic training to break recruits down and build them back up to fit military standards. Right from the moment you show up, you're cut off from everything. Your environment, family, friends, all of it. They push this even further with strict rules around communications, so you're not making a bunch of phone calls or writing letters home. The whole point is to strip away your old identity and civilian mindset so they can shape you into what they need, a soldier who thinks and acts by Army values. The pressure is constant, and the isolation only adds to it, which all makes you more open to the intense indoctrination that's coming your way. Over time, this whole process helps to erase any sense of individualism, replacing it with a collective identity that's all about obedience, discipline, and being one with the group. The Army wants soldiers who work as a unit, and this isolation together, as I call it, is a huge part of how they get you there. If you are interested in donating to the publishing of Culting of America, the link is in the bio. Also, if you're buying signed copies of Uncultured from me, you are donating to the Culting of America. Thank you. I got this scarf in New York City. This is like knockoff Louis Vuitton scarf. And I was going to make it a regular scarf again, which is cut open down the center. But when I just cut it in half, it started to shred. And I was like, oh, that's not going to work. So now I invented the like tunic scarf again. And I thought I looked like a soldier from Alice in Wonderland, playing card soldier. And then I put the fuzzy sleeves on it. I was like, now it is perfection. And I was just telling Mr. Knitting Coat Lady, like, it's either ridiculous or high fash. But I think what nobody tells you is if you wear it with confidence, then it's high fash. And of course, we did the circular logic earrings and the thought-stopping cliche headbands. All right, back to reading about isolation. In Dr. Alexandra Stein's Love, Terror, and Brainwashing, which we're going to be reading soon in Cult Theory Book Club, she explains how totalist leaders use isolation to create disorganized attachment, which creates dissociation, which makes your programming stick. Totalist leaders, either directly or through their organizations, create a relationship of disorganized attachment by isolating people from their prior sources of support and replacing those with a new and frightening safe haven. We know from attachment research that disorganized attachments, which involves seeking proximity with the frightening attachment figure when there is no other attachment figure or escape available, causes a dissociative response. Dissociation separates thinking from feeling. It disintegrates the left logical, verbal thinking side of the brain from the right emotional, nonverbal side of the brain. The dissociated person's ability to think clearly about the relationship is impaired, and so they are now in a position to accept the group's views, its ideology. This ideology is in place to further bolster the elements of isolation, terror, and love, and to explain away feelings of fear induced in the follower. Emotionally, the dissociated person tends to draw closer to the group, as it is now their only remaining safe haven. Everyone reading this who has been to any of the branches of the military's initial entry training, basic training, boot camp, etc., understands that this is essentially what our drill sergeants were doing to us during those first few weeks of complete isolation. One of the most interesting parts of the Army's isolation tactics during basic training is how you're completely cut off from the outside world, but never actually alone. From day one, they enforce a buddy system, just like we had growing up in the Children of God cult. So you're always paired with someone. You literally can't go anywhere without your buddy. And this constant presence of another person kills any sense of privacy or autonomy you might have left. That constant monitoring ensures you're accountable 24/7, not just to the higher ups, but to everyone around you. It's a smart tactic for reinforcing discipline and driving home that collective identity the Army is so intent on building. You're never truly on your own. Someone's always watching, and everyone's keeping tabs on each other. It creates a system where the group polices itself, making sure you stay in line without needing constant top-down enforcement. We found out in the last chapter that this is called performative regulation. We see this same kind of isolation but never alone dynamic weaponized in the so-called troubled teen industry. Unpin my book because they not happy with me. These programs are often tucked away in remote locations, both in the US and abroad. And that's no accident. It's a deliberate strategy, what some call geographic abuse, designed to cut off kids from their families, their familiar environments, and any possible support system. The remoteness isn't just about being out in the middle of nowhere. It's about making the kids feel completely trapped. They can't easily communicate with the outside world, and the idea of escaping, forget about it. They're miles away from anything or anyone that could help, with little hope for intervention and even less chance of running away. The isolation is total, leaving these kids stuck, powerless, and completely at the mercy of the system. Modern corporations, too, have mastered the art of isolation to maintain control and boost productivity. Take Amazon. Their warehouses are infamous for monitoring workers so closely and discouraging interaction that the environment starts to feel isolating. The tech giant uses scanners along with computers at workstation and software developed to track their performance to a degree that critics say is unlike any other company. Or Google, where the intense work culture with its all-consuming focus on productivity can make employees feel like they're living in a bubble. And now, with tech giants building massive campuses filled with perks designed to keep you on campus, even during your free time, employees are spending less time with family and more natural communities. Trilogy, a startup from the early 2000s, did something similar to Zappos when its CEO moved the headquarters to San Antonio to cut employees off from distractions and focus solely on the company. Emily Chang tells us in Brotopia that they did this on purpose to emulate cult leader tactics. early Trilogy executives compared building the company to building a cult. The first thing you have to do is isolate, Trilogy's former VP John Price remembered 2 decades later. She also tells us that new hires immediately spent 12 weeks bonding and training at a company boot camp called Trilogy University. Price said they wanted to create cohesion and bonding at the level that military guys have in a foxhole when they have bullets flying overhead. Then added, if you ever study cults, that's how they do it. And then Captain Mestenek adds a snarky little footnote. Though this military gal would like you to know that we haven't fought wars this way in a really long time, regardless of what the bros imagine. The effects of this corporate isolation are starting to show, as happened tragically with Zappos. Isolation also fosters a deep dependency on the company. When your workplace becomes your entire world, your sense of identity starts to merge with the corporate culture. It's no longer just a job. It becomes who you are. That kind of dependency takes a psychological toll. Employees feel constant pressure to perform, and as the line between work and personal life blurs, burnout becomes almost inevitable. Without meaningful connections outside the workplace, it's easy to forget who you are beyond your role in the company. When they tell you the company is family and encourage you to make it your whole life, it can be hard to resist. As a tech employee said to the New York Times, getting laid off is one thing, but being disowned by your family after 18 years is another. How are we doing on YouTube? Hello. Now you understand boarding schools. Exactly. Isolation tactics crop up in more places than you might expect. Academia, hospitals, teaching. Take junior faculty, for example. They're often cut off from peers and forced to rely on senior faculty for career advancement. That's a dangerous dynamic. New York teachers face something similar. They're tossed into chaotic classrooms with new teachers, not New York teachers, with minimal support, left to sink or swim. Jeffrey Morrell and Simona Golden called it out in The Atlantic with their piece, Alone in the Classroom, Why Teachers Are Too Isolated. They dug into Dan Lorty's 1975 research, which highlights how teachers since the 19th century have been locked into a system where, as Lorty put it, each teacher spent his day isolated from other adults. The initial pattern of school distribution represented a series of cells which were constructed as self-sufficient. I heard recently that the same blueprint they use for prisons is what they use for high schools. And by the way, I definitely compare high school to a prison in Uncultured, my critically acclaimed best-selling memoir that you can get copies of pinned here. Hang on, now I gotta pin it. The bros have found me, so I keep waking up in the morning and they're like, your creator count is suspended for a month. And then I go appeal and I'm like, this isn't blah, blah, blah. This is my field of expertise and I'm critically examining things. And in like 2 hours, they're like, okay, your account is back. This lack of collaboration doesn't just stifle innovation. It creates a deeper kind of isolation, the kind that makes it harder to push back against bad policies or advocate for yourself. Teachers end up in a compliance-heavy system that leaves little room for creativity or genuine connection. What's worse, this isolation isn't always obvious. It's not just about physical separation. It's the emotional and mental walls that keep people locked into the group's reality. That's a hallmark of high control groups, including cults. Isolation isn't always blatant. Sometimes it's subtle, reinforced through the group's culture to ensure everyone toes the line and keeps the status quo intact. I did not cable that correctly. My knitting limitations. Doing complicated cables whilst reading. I can do it, though. I can do it with a broken heart. Hey, Washington State. I lived there for 5 years. Okay, so now we go into all these different types of isolation. We'll see how many we get through. I have to go by 1:30 because my child insists on being picked up from school. Psychological isolation. Sometimes this isolation happens right inside your own head. You get so insulated from outside perspectives that the group's worldview becomes your entire reality. When there's no outside input, leaders can manipulate you more easily because you're not hearing anything that might make you stop and think, wait, does this even make sense? Cult leaders are pros at isolating people mentally, even when they're physically surrounded by others. They use sneaky psychological tactics like throwing around thought-stopping cliches. Phrases like doubt your doubts or Satan is testing you sound innocent enough, but they're designed to shut down any critical thinking. These little sayings push members to blindly accept whatever the group teaches, making questioning feel like failure or sin. The beauty or horror of it is that the leaders don't need to lock you away in some remote places. They just create a mental space where stepping outside the group's teachings feels like stepping into danger. Over time, Amanda Montell tells us, this loaded language acquires a strong emotional charge. When a word or phrase takes on such baggage that its mere mention can spark fear, grief, dread, jubilation, reverence, anything, a leader can exploit it to steer followers' behaviors. It goes deeper than just a few catchy phrases. Though, cults constantly remind members of the doctrine, repeating it over and over until it becomes second nature. As Singer puts it, reflective, critical, evaluative thought, especially that critical of the cult, becomes aversive and avoided. It's like if everyone around you believes it, you start to think, well, it must be true. Over time, this creates the illusion that you're choosing to stay, when really the high-pressure environment subtly pushes you into compliance one step at a time, while keeping the end goal hidden until you are locked into the group. Amanda Montell describes this as language tactics, gets people to feel dependent on the leader, such as life outside the groups doesn't feel possible anymore. I often say it takes about 6 months to fully onboard into groups like the Children of God or even the US Army. During that time, you have no real clue what you've signed up for, but you know you've worked hard for it. Are you really going to walk away after all that effort, even if you don't totally agree with the latest regulation or revelation? I have the thing up in front, so I can't really see the comments, but I'm coming back here to see them. I really like my revelation regulation part. I'm hoping my editor lets that stay. Even when members around the world are out in the world, socializing with others, the psychological isolation can stick. The group's influence is so all-encompassing that it acts like a mental filter for everything they experience. A member might be physically present at a family gathering, but mentally they're still operating within the group's boundaries. Every conversation, every interaction gets viewed through the lens of the group's teaching, making it almost impossible to connect with others on a real human level. The member will appear as you or I do and will function well in ordinary tasks, Margaret Singer explains. The cult lectures and procedures tend to gradually induce members to experience anxiety whenever they critically evaluate the cult. Over time, they learn to avoid critical thinking altogether, especially about the group, because doing so triggers guilt and anxiety. It's a clever self-policing system that keeps people from even considering dissent. I am reading from my next book, The Culting of America. Uncultured. My current book is my memoir about growing up in the Children of God and going into the cult of the U.S. Army. And it is pinned here on TikTok if you want a signed copy. And you can also get it on Instagram, but I'm not sure how. Oh, let's see. Can we? Nope. There must be some way because I'm allowed to do products now, but I still don't know how to, if I know how to pin them. Well, all right. And then this is the book that I'm writing now. This kind of mental isolation can be even more powerful than physical separation. It entangles the member's identity so deeply with the group that their entire reality is shaped by it. Even when they're free to move about in the world, they're never really free because their thoughts, reactions, and decisions are still under the group's control. In Netflix's Twin Flames docuseries, we see a woman who is in the cult from her bedroom. And though she interacts on a daily basis with her father, mother, and sister, there is little they can do to break through to her. Isolation from friends, family, and even the past. Dr. Janja Lalich breaks it down in Take Back Your Life. In almost every cult, over time, members become separated from their past. Cult leaders build an us versus them narrative, painting anyone outside the group as a threat or someone who just doesn't get it. Loved ones, they're often labeled as negative influences, and communication with them is discouraged or outright forbidden. Margaret Singer even describes a political cult that had recruits lie to their parents while a leader stood by, coaching them through the call. It's a calculated move designed not just to sever family ties, but to train members to obey irrational orders without question. But it doesn't stop there. Cults push members to abandon everything that connects them to their old lives. Hobbies, jobs, even the smallest habits that don't align with the group's ideology. Sometimes members are urged to take on new names, symbolizing a full break from their former selves. Names are so much more than just words. They're tied to who we are at our core. As the psychology of changing your name points out, our names are attached to our identities and are a big part of who we are. So when cults push members to take on new names, it's not just some quirky tradition. It's a calculated move to cut ties with their old life and cement their new identities in the group. And when I tell people that military rank and last name is a new name, they get really upset with me. But I'm sorry, I don't think your parents were running around calling you Lieutenant Mestinek when you were 4 years old. It's a name change. This idea connects to something called name identity mismatch. Oh, and by the way, in the Marines, they're not referred to by name and they're not even allowed to use personal pronouns while they're in initial entry training. A Marine will show up here and correct me in the YouTube comments. Where someone's name identity mismatch, where someone's name no longer feels like it fits who they've become, leading them to change it. In a cult, though, this isn't about personal growth. It's about control. By assigning new names, cults break down a person's original identity and rebuild it around the group's beliefs. The result? Members become even more dependent on the cult for their sense of self and place in the world. It's all part of the same strategy, dismantling someone's identity piece by piece and replacing it with one built entirely around the cult's beliefs. The deeper someone sinks into this new identity, the harder it becomes to imagine returning to their old life. Every day spent cut off from family, friends, and their former sense of self makes the outside world seem more foreign, more unreachable. That isolation builds an invisible wall, keeping members trapped, not just physically, but mentally. That isolation builds an invisible wall. Leaving starts to feel like stepping into a void with no support system to catch them if they fall. This isn't accidental, it's by design. By stripping away a person's connections, their sense of individuality, and their ties to the past, cult leaders make the group the center of their world. The cult becomes everything: their safety net, their community, their purpose. And once someone reaches that point, the thought of leaving isn't just scary, it feels impossible. It's a slow, methodical process, but it's devastatingly effective at locking people in. Next is social media and information isolation. Oh yes, Mormonism is my exact example for walking around isolation. Like they're walking around, but they're completely isolated from the world. And in fact, access to the internet is what I think is currently breaking Mormonism. Like I think we're watching Mormonism break in real time, which is fun for me. Information control is a huge part of how high control groups, especially cults, keep their grip on people. Leaders carefully manage what members see and hear, trapping them in an echo chamber where only the group's ideas get reinforced. The Children of God had military-style classification on all the doctrine our leader put out. In the US Army, everything is labeled with information control tags like unclassified, secret, top secret, to protect against leaks. Mormons fiercely guard what happens in their temple. Sacred, not secret. Coca-Cola defends its secret formula, and even movies come with ratings to control who gets to see them. All of these are kinds of information control. I do take commissions for knitted projects. That's what I'm doing now. Someone asked if we knew what she's knitting. She's knitting a sweater. It has a really cool cable pattern on the front. And it's for not me. Cults have always used information control as a tactic, long before the internet was a thing. Back in the day, it might have looked like cults banning certain types of books, Harry Potter, or even all books. And like, have the good guys ever turned out to be the ones who banned books? Well, these days, it's more likely to show up as the denigration of social media sites from the pulpit. But cult leaders have always known that they have to cut their members off from information. One trusty way they do that is by teaching their members to disbelieve the news. And if you are thinking about Donald Trump right now, yes. The cult's strategy is just as much about creating a mental barrier as it is any physical one. Social media does its information control through algorithms, feeding people only the content that fits their beliefs. QAnon was a perfect example of this. People got sucked into their own little digital worlds, completely cut off from reality, and fed increasingly extreme content. It was designed to keep people hooked, making their views more and more radical without them even realizing it. Over time, they were seeing only one side of the story, and it became nearly impossible to step back and see the bigger picture. With artificial intelligence and social media algorithms, this kind of isolation is only going to get worse. In an article in The New Yorker titled, "What Makes a Cult a Cult?" Zoe Heller tells us that the silos of political groupthink created by social media have turned out to be ideal settings for the germination and dissemination of extremist and alternative realities. Discussing the phenomenon of QAnon, which scholars struggle to define as a cult, Heller tells us, it's possible that our traditional definitions of what constitutes a cult organization will have to adapt to the internet age and a new model of crowdsourced cult. This kind of digital isolation is powerful. It doesn't just separate people from the truth. It makes them cling harder to their group's beliefs. Once inside a conspiratorial identity bubble, people experience constant reinforcement of their conspiracy beliefs, are encouraged to adopt more extreme beliefs, and are likely to associate core aspects of their self-concept with those beliefs. When you're constantly surrounded by the same ideas, it becomes really hard to think any other way. Singer explains that when cut off from social support, social background, families, Familiar surroundings, friends, jobs, schoolmates, and classes, and brought into a new environs with a new ambiance, few can resist the pull to fit in. It used to be that cults would almost have to physically isolate their members, but now we can be just as isolated digitally, almost without even realizing it. We're getting trapped in these echo chambers, and soon enough, opposing viewpoints don't even exist to us anymore. We end up in a loop of radical ideas, which isolates us further from reality. Social media's echo chambers are like the new age isolation rooms, and the algorithms running our feeds are the ones locking the doors. An article titled Thinking Outside the Bubble, Addressing Polarization and Disinformation on Social Media, talks about how platforms like these amplify polarizations, not just ideological differences like debating policies, but something even worse, affective polarization. That's when we stop just disagreeing with people and start actively disliking them just because they're on the other side. And the scary part, it's all designed to feed us more of what we already believe, reinforcing our biases and keeping us stuck in these loops of one-sided perspectives. Sociologist Jack Goldstone even compares today's political climate to the years leading up to the Civil War. Yep, it's that serious. Social media has basically become this self-reinforcing system that isolates us from opposing views and strengthens our sense of us versus them. It's no wonder we're seeing more disconnection and disinformation than ever before. The platforms might claim to connect us, but really they're driving us further apart. I can already tell this part is way too long. This algorithmic radicalization is so well recognized now that it has its own Wikipedia page. It is the concept that recommender algorithms on popular social media sites such as YouTube and Facebook drive users toward progressively more extreme content over time, leading them to developing radicalized extremist political views. Algorithms record user interactions from likes and dislikes to amount of time spent on posts to generate endless media aimed to keep users engaged. Through echo chamber channels, the consumer is driven to be more polarized through preferences in media and self-confirmation. As we get fed increasingly radical content, our worldviews can shift without us even realizing it. Once embedded within these virtual networks of fellow believers and increasingly cut off from non-believers, individuals will tend to find their conspiracy beliefs are reinforced and, as discussed above, may even become a central feature of their social identities. What starts out as a mild interest can spiral into extreme beliefs, like supporting someone as controversial as Donald Trump for president, even after everything that's happened. In his farewell address, President Obama warned about the dangers of people isolating themselves in ideological silos or bubbles, where they only listen to information that aligns with their existing beliefs and biases. He stressed that this isolation can lead to further division and polarization, as individuals become more entrenched in their beliefs without exposure to differing perspectives. He emphasized that this tendency makes it harder to have constructive conversations and understand different perspectives, ultimately threatening democracy. He urged Americans to step outside their comfort zones, engage with diverse viewpoints, and work toward a shared reality that respects facts and reasons. The rise of naked partisanship and increasing economic and regional stratification, the splintering of our media into a channel for every taste, all this makes this great sorting seem natural, even inevitable. And increasingly, we become so secure in our bubbles that we start accepting only information that fits our opinions, instead of basing our opinions on the evidence that is out there. One tactic the Army uses to drive home just how cut off you are from the outside world during basic training is to tell the group that a famous celebrity or politician has died. It is a cruel joke, really, because by the time you can get an answer or verify anything, weeks have passed. usually at least 3. You start to realize just how much they control every bit of information you get from the outside world. My ex-husband's basic training class, just 6 months before mine, was told that J-Lo had died, which, as you can imagine, caused quite a stir amongst the guys. So when a drill sergeant burst into our bay in late June 2009 with some wild story about Michael Jackson dying, there was no way I was falling for it, no matter the tears streaming down his face. It worked the same way, though. By the time we got confirmation that it was this time true, I had a perfectly good understanding of just how much we had been cut off from all outside information. It's not just about technology. Members are taught to view the outside world with suspicion, to see it as corrupt, even evil. They're told that only the group has the real truth and that everyone else is either deceived or deliberately misleading them. Cult leaders know that if members start trusting external sources, the carefully crafted narrative could unravel. So they employ strategies to keep everyone inside an information bubble. This is especially relevant today with AI and social media algorithms that can be manipulated to reinforce. Okay, that paragraph just needs to go away because that is boring and repetitive. I'm reading from Culting of America, the next book. QAnon is another prime example. People who got deeply involved in QAnon found themselves so immersed in conspiracy theories and their relentless quest for hidden truths that their real lives started to take a backseat. They spent hours glued to their screens, digging through forums, decoding cryptic messages, and watching endless videos that promised to reveal the truth about global elites. They often neglected their jobs, missed important family events, or withdrew from social activities. Convinced that their mission to expose the so-called hidden cabal was more important than anything else. Some reported losing touch with loved ones who didn't share their beliefs, creating rifts in relationships that were once close. Do you need me? Okay. I'm planning to go pick up. If you want me to go, I can go. Okay. Then I'll not go out in the snow. For example, a father might have skipped his child's school event to attend a QAnon rally, believing he was fighting a greater battle. Or a mother might have stopped caring about household responsibilities, consumed by her belief that she was uncovering secrets to save the world. This obsessive engagement led to a detachment from the real world, as the line between online conspiracy and everyday reality blurred, leaving their actual lives neglected and in disarray. And one way or the other, cults will always try to convince you that your mission is more important than your children. This isolated mindset is reinforced by constant repetition. Use of thought-stopping techniques. No, it's going to go away. Okay, all this is going to go away. Economic and financial isolation. High control groups know exactly what they're doing when they keep members hungry, scared, poor, tired, pregnant, and busy. It's a strategy that ramps up dependency by creating a cycle of exhaustion, stress, and financial strain that makes leaving feel impossible. Economic control plays a massive role here. Groups use tactics like financial penalties, debt, or even non-compete clauses to trap members. When you're barely scraping by or drowning in obligations, you're not exactly in a position to pack up and leave. Basketball in small towns. Yes, I've heard a lot of like kids sports being compared to culty stuff. I don't know if Zoe Heller is a relative of Joseph Heller, but maybe. Some groups go all in on cutting members off from money entirely. In the Children of God and Scientology's Sea Org, members give up everything: freedom, jobs, assets, to live completely within the group. They donate property, family heirlooms, and most importantly, their time and labor. Members don't have outside jobs, so their entire survival depends on the group. The financial isolation is glaring. Leave the cult and you lose your home, your income, and everything you've given. There's no getting back the money, the assets, or the years you've sacrificed. It's a powerful way to keep people stuck. The military has its own way of isolating people, not with walls or gates, but through financial and professional ties that keep members locked in. Service members often spend years, even decades, in a system so structured and separate from the civilian world that it might as well be another planet. The military pays just enough to make life feel stable, especially for young recruits, and throws in houses for getting bonuses for getting married or having kids, which conveniently nudges people toward those life choices early. But stability always comes at a price. When you leave, it feels like you're hitting the reset button on everything. After years of following orders and living in rigid hierarchy, the transition to civilian life can feel disorienting, like free falling without a parachute. The pay cuts and career shifts that come with starting over don't help. The structure, though isolating, once kept everything in place and now feels like an anchor, weighing you down, making independence seem like a nearly impossible climb. And not to mention, there is not one other job in the United States of America that offers all-inclusive health insurance. I think that's true. Multi-level marketing schemes, often called commercial cults, also use financial control to keep people trapped. MLMs don't just encourage members to quit their jobs, they even suggest getting their spouses to quit too. It's eerily similar to the military, where the spouse often ends up even more isolated than the service member, unable to maintain a career because of constant relocations. We'll talk more about geographic abuse later. The bottom line: if someone tells you to quit your job and come follow me, you should probably run. They're likely trying to rope you into their cults. Large American religious cults that are more accepted in American culture, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, also rely heavily on financial control. Members are often required to donate significant portions of their income, along with their time and labor, leaving them financially dependent on the group. A 2014 Pew Research survey found that Jehovah's Witnesses rank dead last in household income among American religious groups. When you're barely making ends meet, starting over without the support you've relied on can feel impossible. Mormon families often pay significant amounts to send their children on missions, typically around $400 a month, which covers housing, travel, and basic living expenses for the 2-year stint. Despite this, many missionaries receive only minimal funds for food and personal expenses, leaving them to live very frugally. They often have to carefully budget their limited resources, which can mean eating inexpensive, repetitive meals and sacrificing comfort. The financial strain on both the missionaries and their families adds another layer of challenge to an already demanding experience. The LDS Church acknowledges that financial sacrifice is part of military service. See this Bible quote and this cult book quote. Missionaries and their families have primary responsibility for contributing financially to missionary service. They should make appropriate sacrifices to provide financial support for a mission. The constant cycle of fear, financial stress, and busy work also serves to keep members of any of these groups too distracted and exhausted to think critically about their situation. When you're constantly worried about meeting the group's demands, there's little time or energy left to question whether those demands are fair or reasonable. This keeps the group's power intact and prevents members from considering alternatives. But what about financial isolation in everyday America? According to the Pew Research Center, personal finances also relate to feelings of loneliness. People who say they are somewhat or very dissatisfied with their personal financial situation are significantly more likely to express feeling frequent loneliness than those who are satisfied with their finances. 17% versus 5. 17%, still not very good. Similarly, 14% of those who say they don't have enough income to lead the kind of life they want report feeling lonely or isolated frequently, compared with just 5% of those with enough income to lead their ideal life. And this is across racial and ethnic and age groups. And marriage is something that makes people less likely to feel lonely. And yet, financial control often traps people in unhealthy relationships. Countless individuals, especially women, are stuck in unhappy or even abusive marriages because they lack the financial means to leave. It's a sobering reality that just 50 years ago, women in the US couldn't even hold credit cards in their own names. As an MSN article highlights, denying women credit wasn't just financial. It was a way to treat them like children and keep them under men's control. And now, financial control over women is finding a new life online with the rise of the tradwife influencer. Picture pastel-filled Instagram feeds with women baking bread, folding laundry, and waxing poetic about traditional values. They're selling the 1950s housewife's fantasy, complete with perfectly styled aprons and a big helping of nostalgia for the good old days. The catch? This ideal comes wrapped in the same old trap: economic dependency. They're pitching financial reliance on your husband as a path to empowerment, dressed up as reclaiming femininity or finding purpose in domestic life. Sure, the aesthetic might look harmless, dreamy even, but the message behind it is just a shinier version of the same dynamic that keep women stuck in bad relationships. Stripping women of their independence and leaving them with nowhere to turn. By calling this dependency empowerment, those influencers blur the line between a free choice and a coerced one, while reinforcing the same patriarchal systems that have always relied on women's unpaid labor and silence to keep running. It's a pretty picture, sure, but one that hides the very real dangers of giving up financial independence in a world that still pays women less, promotes them less, and leaves them scrambling to make up the difference. And all of this is especially true if you are not a white woman. The financial control has lingering effects today. Many women fear the economic fallout of divorce, with concerns about living on one income and the cost of divorce itself. According to a Forbes report, these worries are consistent across all age groups. Economic dependency often leads women to stay in relationships that are detrimental to their well-being because the financial risk of leaving feels too great. On top of this, the pandemic has further exacerbated the problem. As NPR reported, women have borne the brunt of job loss since the pandemic began and are now experiencing a slower economic recovery than their male counterparts in the workplace. This makes it even harder for women to achieve financial independence, leaving them more vulnerable to being trapped in relationships they'd leave if they could afford to. Nope, I don't think we ever found out who Q was. Secrecy and isolation in high control groups. Dr. Alexandra Stein talks about how secrecy is a cornerstone of control in cults and high demand groups, especially during the recruitment phase. Secrecy is a powerful control mechanism in many areas of group life, but in the recruitment phase, it functions particularly well to establish isolation early on. She explains, by introducing secrecy early, groups create a sense of exclusivity. This idea that members are being let in on hidden truths. that outsiders can't access. It's intoxicating. It makes people feel special, like they're part of an elite inner circle, while also cutting off outside perspectives that might make them question what's happening. Secrecy also serves to shield the group from external scrutiny. Members are often told that outsiders wouldn't understand or might twist the group's teachings. This reinforces the us versus them mentality and makes it harder for anyone to step in and challenge the leader's authority. Dr. Stein, reflecting on her own experience in a political cult, notes how security is the reason given for high levels of secrecy and centralization. Such groups operate on the need to know principle. If you've ever worked in the military or held a government job with secret or top secret clearance, you'll recognize this tactic. It's about limiting who gets access to information and ensuring that only the inner circle controls the flow. Cults thrive on this kind of secrecy, weaponizing it to isolate members from the outside world. New recruits are told not to share what they're learning with outsiders because they wouldn't get it. This tactic pulls double duty. It boosts the recruit's sense of importance while also cutting off access to outside opinions that could challenge the group's beliefs. As Dr. Stein points out, this means the only people with whom the new recruit can reflect upon their often unsettling experience are those already in the group or undergoing the same training. Sharing doubts or reflecting with someone outside the system becomes off limits, which ensures that members stay insulated within the group's narrative. But of course, the secrecy is mostly to benefit the cult leader. The leader is special, after all, because he has access to secret things. Singer tells us that these determined, self-designated gurus seem to always be lurking on the sidelines, ready to step in and offer answers to life's problems. They claim they have the only and sure way of life. They induce people to follow them by touting a special mission and special knowledge. The special mission is to preach the contents of a supposedly secret learning, which the leaders assert can only be revealed to those who join them. Dr. Stein shared her own personal experience thus. Secrecy ran through all levels of the organization. I was not to speak to my husband about any organizational issues, nor he to me about his activities in the group, past or present. Thus, I was not to find out about how he was beaten for an unapproved relationship he had prior to our arranged marriage, nor did I hear of the physical and sexual abuse of others in the group. In the military, a lot of the specialized groups, your Army Rangers or Special Forces, including their aviation regiment, Navy SEALs or Air Force parajumpers, secrecy reigns supreme. Nobody is supposed to talk about Air Force Special Operations selection, the weeks of harrowing training in isolation that potential recruits go through. Army helicopter pilots go through a survival, evasion, capture, and recovery course in case they find themselves shot down over enemy lines. And it is so forbidden for pilots to talk about what they go through in SEER school. And without fail, we find that the higher the level of secrecy the organization wields, the higher the quotient of cultiness, and usually of bad behavior. Even just working in military intelligence, where we do the majority of our work behind double locked doors, can become an incredibly toxic work environment. One that I used to describe as kids running around without adult supervision. Theranos is an example of weaponized secrecy with detrimental effects. According to Lauren Rogel in her article, Secrets, Lies, and Lessons from the Theranos Scandal, Theranos sought to avoid exposure by cultivating an environment of secrecy and intimidation, and by aggressively extracting and enforcing non-disclosure agreements. The legal landscape for whistleblowers facilitated this strategy, while whistleblowing employees enjoyed certain protections under anti-retaliation statutes, trade secret statutes, and common law contract principles. These protections were neither readily accessible nor certain. Holmes employed a double strategy. Sorry, my needle's done broke again. Double strategy of secrecy and constant suspicion, enforced with NDAs and intimidation tactics, like threatening employees with legal and financial ramifications. The secrecy is how Holmes managed to convince so many people that they were creating a technology that didn't exist. Employees who talked to ABC reported that Holmes arranged the company so that everyone was purposely siloed. Employees weren't supposed to communicate with each other about their tasks. They were also advised to not reveal the company name on social media sites like LinkedIn. The immense secrecy was apparently to protect what Holmes felt were trade secrets. But of course, the main secret they were all unwittingly protecting was that, like every cult, the whole thing was a con. By weaponizing secrecy and isolation in her company, Elizabeth was able to concentrate power in herself, creating an environment where she kept everyone else dependent and in the dark. The lack of transparency and open communication not only suppressed dissent, but also stifled any real innovation, as individuals were absolutely discouraged from challenging the status quo or seeking new ways of thinking. But it's not just fake startups, it's everywhere. In her article published in 2021, Rogal tells us that non-disclosure agreements have been making headlines. The hashtag #MeToo movement revealed a pattern of corporations extracting NDAs from sexual misconduct victims, effectively shielding the perpetrators and perpetuating their behavior. President Donald Trump notoriously required NDAs from employees at the Trump Organization and his presidential campaign. Long and unquestioned staple of corporate legal risk management, NDAs have acquired a dubious reputation for concealing information that would be in the public interest to disseminate. Corporate secrets are everywhere, hidden beneath layers of non-disclosure agreements, proprietary technology, and internal policies that keep sensitive information locked away from the public. These secrets aren't just about protecting trade knowledge. They're also a way to maintain control. Companies thrive on secrecy to safeguard their competitive edge, but this same secrecy can prevent transparency and accountability. Employees are often kept in the dark about big decisions, financial matters, or internal issues, leaving them unable to question or challenge the corporate structure. This is my book called The Culting of America, and this chapter is on isolation. Enron had the audacity to chisel the word integrity into marble outside their Houston headquarters, an ironic badge of honor for a company built on deception. While the facade gleamed with promises of transparency and trust, the reality behind those walls was secrecy weaponized to the extreme. Enron executives spun a web so dense with manipulation and hidden financial tricks that even regulators and investors couldn't untangle it until it all came crashing down. And one of those Enron VPs was Elizabeth Holmes' father of Theranos. Their culture thrived on withholding critical information, not just from outsiders, but from employees too. The marble inscription, meant to inspire confidence, instead became a monument to one of history's most infamous cases of corporate hypocrisy. But Enron wasn't unique in its use of secrecy as a tool of power. Countless companies do the same, especially when it comes to salaries. Even though it's illegal in the US to ban employees from discussing pay, many organizations create an environment where talking about money is taboo. This enforced silence keeps workers in the dark about pay discrepancy, leaving them powerless to challenge unfair practices. By keeping salaries secret, companies protect themselves, allowing inequities to persist unchecked. And this isn't some long-lost relic of the past. As the BBC points out, in many sectors in the US, a combination of long-standing taboo and company policies keep people from discussing how much money they make, a phenomenon known as pay secrecy. Despite legislation that prohibits companies from punishing workers who disclose their pay, many people still work in environments where they don't or can't talk about money, something that has a profound knock-on effects on wage equality. Secrecy, as it turns out, isn't just a tool for cover-ups or shady bookkeeping. It's a key strategy in maintaining control, whether in a toxic corporate environment or within more overtly oppressive systems. It's what keeps the powerful in power and everyone else guessing. See what I mean? This is too long. Geographic abuse and language isolation. Geographic abuse is one of those sneaky but powerful tools high control groups use to isolate people and keep them dependent. The playbook is simple. Relocate members to remote or unfamiliar places, far from home, and the people who might help them question their situation. Once you're cut off from your support systems, family, friends, and the comforting routines of home, you become so much easier to control. Add in unfamiliar languages or cultural barriers, and it's like throwing a lock on the door. Suddenly, leaving isn't just hard, it feels impossible. Unpin the book. Pin it again. Yeah, it is the first book. That's the story. This is the research book. Jim Jones perfected this with Jonestown, packing up hundreds of his People's Temple followers and shipping them off to a remote corner of Guyana. It wasn't just about building some socialist utopia. It was about control. The further they got from the US, from their families, the media, anyone who might have pulled them out, the tighter his grip became. Trapped in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense jungle and unfamiliarity, they had nowhere to run and no one to turn to. But Jones wasn't doing anything new. Wasn't this just a modern version of the Puritans heading to America, seeking isolation for their sacred mission? Same concept, different century. Growing up in the Children of God, I saw geographic abuse firsthand, though I didn't have the words for it back then. We were shipped all over the world, usually to avoid the heat of law enforcement or bad press. My family was constantly on the move, and I never got a say in where we lived. The first time I set foot in the US, the country I was technically a citizen of, I finally understood why they kept us so far away. In San Diego, it would have been laughably easy to walk away compared to the middle of Brazil, where we'd just been. At 10, I started teaching myself Portuguese in secret, studying with dictionaries and encyclopedias because I realized that language was power. By the time I was 12 and fluent, I knew I had a tool that could save me. If I ever needed to run, I'd at least have the words to ask for help. The Mormon Church takes a similar approach with missionaries. They send these young people to foreign countries, barely equipping them with enough language skills to order lunch, let alone navigate a complex cultural landscape. Isolated from family with only church-approved phrases at their disposal, they're stuck. Some missionaries have even reported having their passports held by leadership, making it literally impossible to leave. It's isolation dressed up as service. And then there's the US Army, a giant machine that thrives on keeping people constantly uprooted. Soldiers and their families bounce from base to base every few years, never staying anywhere long enough to form real, lasting connections. Though this also does make it impossible for the US military to split in half by geographic location and politics. Sure, soldiers might find camaraderie within their units, but for their families, it's a different story. Spouses and kids are always the new people in town, starting over at new schools, jobs, and social circles. The constant moving makes it hard to invest in any community. It's a lifestyle that teaches you to not get too attached because goodbyes are inevitable. For military kids, this becomes a coping mechanism, pulling back emotionally long before a move is announced, bracing themselves for the next round of goodbyes. Over time, it creates a sense of rootlessness, a feeling that no place is truly home. But geographic isolation isn't just a cult or military problem. It's baked into modern life. Americans are more scattered than ever, chasing jobs and opportunities far from the communities they grew up in. The pandemic only accelerated this. The so-called Great Reshuffling saw 1 in 4 Americans considering a move, with 17% actually doing it, according to a Washington Post article. And it's not just the moving itself, it's how our ways of connecting have changed. Remote work and online socializing mean fewer chances to meet people in real life, making it harder to build friendships, especially in a new place. Without those day-to-day interactions, it's easy to feel untethered and disconnected. And also, this is when cults like to recruit you when you've just moved. Geographic abuse, whether deliberate or incidental, works because isolation makes people vulnerable. When you're cut off from the people and places that ground you, it's hard to imagine a way out. Whether you're in the jungle with Jim Jones, knocking on doors as a missionary, or starting over in a new city for a job. It's a reminder that our sense of connection and belonging isn't just nice to have, it's essential. Only 2 more. 3 more. Isolation through busyness. When I first started thinking about doing a PhD, one of the questions I wanted to tackle was, how much time does it take for something, an idea, a person, an organization, to completely monopolize someone's mental space? My personal guess was that outside of work, it might only take 20 to 30 hours a week. The reason I kept circling back to this question was because I'd seen how isolation worked as a tool for control in cults, in the military, and in everyday life. I used to tell my boss, when we're all living at home and just coming to work in uniform every day, the army doesn't feel that culty. But the minute we go away together to training or deployment, it's really culty. Excuse me, folks. Hello.
Do you know if she had play rehearsal today?
I didn't think so.
Well, I don't have our kid, but I also didn't see Kira, I didn't see Evelyn, I didn't see Alice.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean I didn't.
I'll look it up as soon as I hang up. But yeah, I assume that she does. Okay. Okay. I guess the kids are doing something. Sorry. Yes to play rehearsal. I'm fine. She had to be a mom for a second. Isolation through busyness. I know, it's good, right? All right. Okay, so when we deploy to training or combat, it's really culty. He gave me this tiny knowing smirk, the kind that said, keep going, you're onto something, and tell me to think more about it. He was one of the only leaders who actually encouraged me when I started comparing my army experiences to the cults I grew up in. Once they realized isolation was central to the total institution or cult experience, the pieces started falling into place. Physical isolation was easy to spot. Growing up on a separatist commune or being shipped off to the Louisiana swamp for army war games made that obvious. But it still left me with questions. I saw Americans around me who were just as cut off in their thinkings and social interactions as I'd been, even though they were walking around in the world. They weren't in a jungle or a swamp, but they were so fully immersed in their organization, hobby, or lifestyle that they might as well have been. Some were in the cult of CrossFit, others organic eating, faith healing, or marathon running. Me, guilty on that one. Cults have mastered the art of using constant busyness to isolate members. It's not always about putting up walls or moving to remote locations. Sometimes all you need is an overpacked schedule. By keeping members running from task to task, meeting to meeting, cult members have no room. Cult leaders leave no room for independent thought or personal reflection. People get too tired to question anything. The relentless pace also cuts them off from outside relationships, ensuring they're too busy to build connections with anyone who might challenge the group's control. Busyness becomes a subtle but incredibly effective tool for isolation. Janja Lalich calls it being isolated from your own mind. How can that happen? If your day starts at 7 a.m. and ends at midnight and is extremely active and filled with group events, it becomes difficult to turn inward and reflect. By the end of the day, when your head hits the pillow, you do not have the energy to stay awake. Take Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. They're experts at this kind of isolation through activity. Members are expected to attend multiple weekly meetings, do personal Bible study, and dedicate hours to door-to-door preaching. On top of that, they're often volunteering at conventions or building kingdom halls. All of this spiritual busyness keeps them so focused on the mission that there's no time left for relationships outside the faith, or even much room to question their own beliefs. It's a system designed to keep people hooked. NeuroLaunch, an online mental health journal, calls this tactic time manipulation. They explain that cults use constant group activities and rituals to exhaust members, making them more compliant. Sleep deprivation plays a big role, too, impairing critical thinking and making it harder for people to resist or push back. The military knows this trick well. From day one of basic training, recruits are plugged into a whirlwind of drills, inspections, and classes. There's no time to think, only to adapt. It's a deliberate strategy to strip away individuality and build obedient soldiers. The parallels to cult indoctrination are hard to miss. Look at startup culture. Companies like Zappos, under Tony Shay's leadership, glorified the grind to the point where exhaustion became a badge of honor. Hustling 24/7 wasn't just encouraged, it was celebrated. People competed to see who could sacrifice more sleep, personal time, or relationship for the company's mission. The pressure to be always on created an environment where burnout wasn't a red flag, it was just part of the job. This obsession with busyness isn't new. In America, idle hands are the devil's workshop has been drilled into us for centuries. Productivity is seen as a moral virtue, and slowing down, or God forbid, resting, is treated as laziness. Hustle culture has taken this to an extreme, turning rest into something to feel guilty about. Even kids are told to stay busy to avoid falling behind, setting them up to equate downtime with failure. The result, a society where exhaustion is celebrated and burnout is the price of admission. A PBS NewsHour discussion on loneliness pointed out that one major culprit is time. People are busy. People are spending more time at work. We just don't have enough free time to connect with the people we care about. Whether it's a cult keeping you occupied with endless tasks, a military schedule designed to leave no room for thought, or a culture that glorifies the grind, the result is the same: isolation. And once you're isolated, it's a lot harder to see a way out. Still not done. You all can tell me which part to cut out, because I think they're all just like so important. But it's okay, because it's 36 pages and my editor is going to cut it down to like 20 or 25. Appearance and hygiene isolation. The cult look isn't just about following rules on what to wear or how to style your hair. It's a way to make sure members stand out from the rest of the world. Uniforms, specific hairstyles, head coverings, or symbolic accessories all serve to visually separate members from outsiders, creating a constant reminder of their otherness. It's like walking around with a giant sign that says, "I don't belong in your world." This visible difference not only makes members feel alienated from anyone outside the group, but it also deepens their dependency on the cult. Over time, what starts as a marker of belonging becomes a source of isolation, reinforcing the idea that no one on the outside could possibly understand or accept them. For kids, poor hygiene can take this isolation to a cruel level. Imagine being the kid at school who's always teased for being dirty or wearing the same clothes too often. It's not just the bullying that hurts, it's the way it forces kids to withdraw. They might avoid making friends or inviting anyone over, scared that their home life, whether it's neglect, poverty, or strict group rules, will make things worse. The label of being the dirty kid creates a cycle of shame and avoidance that makes school a lonely, unsafe place. For these kids, the isolation isn't just emotional, it's baked into their daily reality. Viola Davis's memoir, Finding Me, reveals the profound humiliation she endured due to hygiene issues stemming from poverty. Terrified of the rats infesting her home, she often avoided nighttime trips to the bathroom, leading to bedwetting. Without access to proper soap, she couldn't eliminate the resulting odor. At school, teachers shamed her and her sister, sending them to the nurse for hygiene lessons without investigating their home circumstances. Peers further ostracized her, refusing to drink from the water fountain after her, labeling her as unclean. Strict group rules can also mean missing out on normal childhood experiences, which only adds to the sense of being other. So if I blocked you and you're here, this tells us all that we need to know about how much you respect people's consent. Strict rules can also mean missing out on normal childhood experiences, which only adds to the sense of being other. When kids can't join in on birthday parties, Halloween celebrations, or even something as simple as reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, which is quite culty, it makes them stand out in the worst ways. Think about Jehovah's Witness kids who don't celebrate birthdays, or evangelical kids who aren't allowed to go trick-or-treating. It's not just about missing the fun. It's about the embarrassment and shame of being singled out as different. For these kids, every "no, you can't" is a reminder that they don't belong, making it harder to build friendships and feel included. Over time, the constant exclusion shapes how kids see themselves and how others see them. They're not just the ones who don't join in, they're the ones who can't join in. That distinction builds walls, not just between the kids and their peers, but between their families and the outside world. And by the way, for everybody watching over here, you have a concern about someone's military career, the proper thing to do is not hound them on the internet. The proper thing to do is go file a Freedom of Information request so that you can see their public military documents. Or you could just read their best-selling book that was cleared by the Pentagon and get all of that information, including her going to the White House and getting an award from President Obama. And here's the coin he gave me. But they just can't stop clutching their man pearls and freaking out when I don't feel the need to validate myself according to them. So that's really fun for me. I'm going to try to be like, show us your whatever. It goes to your credibility. So I think 230,000 people watching me every day goes to my credibility. I think the chapter of my book published in Rolling Stone magazine goes to my credibility. Okay, and finally, isolation through shaming and gaslighting. Shaming and gaslighting are the bread and butter of every high control leader's playbook. Cult leaders, toxic bosses, abusive partners, and narcissistic parents alike know exactly how to wield these tools as weapons. Shaming isolates people, makes them feel unworthy, and convinces them they don't belong. Bernard Goldstein, PhD, tells us in a Psychology Today article that more intense shame yields a profound sense of isolation due to feeling flawed or even unlovable. It can also foster hypervigilance in an effort to avoid exposure of one's perceived flaws or vulnerability to future shaming. As such, it may also be at the core of intense perfectionism. Gaslighting, on the other hand, is a psychological labyrinth. It doesn't just distort the truth, it dismantles your trust in yourself. It's not lying, it's rewriting reality so relentlessly that you stop trusting your own memories, instincts, and thoughts. Cult leaders are experts in this. They deny things they said or did, accuse you of misunderstanding, and twist their actions into some higher purpose you just can't grasp yet. If you push back, the response is predictable. You're too sensitive, or you're not spiritual enough. Over time, you stop pushing back altogether. You start to doubt yourself instead, questioning your sanity, convincing yourself the problem isn't them, it's you. And that's when they've got you. Jim Jones and Charles Diederich mastered these techniques of control. Jones's infamous catharsis sessions were nothing more than emotional eviscerations masquerading as group therapy. Confessions turned public beatdowns, leaving the confessor shattered and the audience thoroughly warned. Dietrich's Synanon called their version the game, a brutal gladiator-style verbal takedown disguised as honesty and self-improvement. But it was never about growth or healing. It was about showing everyone exactly who held the power. Martha Stout tells us that sociopaths, people with no intervening sense of obligation based in attachments to others, typically devote their lives to interpersonal games, to winning, to domination for the sake of domination. And once again, if you're thinking of Donald Trump, yes. These degradation ceremonies don't just humiliate, they erase identity. It's about severing the connections that make someone feel grounded, leaving them dependent on the group or leader for any sense of validation. They strip away autonomy, leaving individuals desperate to reclaim even a shred of belonging. Cults rebrand these rituals as spiritual growth or purification, but they're nothing more than mechanisms of control. You can see this same playbook outside cult compounds too. Hazing in fraternities or the military, public reprimands by your religious leaders, and corrective meetings in corporate settings can all follow the same principle. Humiliate enough and conformity follows. According to encyclopedia.com, according to encyclopedias.com definition of degradation ceremonies, law courts are one example where degradation ceremonies are carried out publicly by professional degraders, lawyers, and judges as an occupational routine. Even at the national level, shaming is wielded like a blunt instrument. Donald Trump built a career on public humiliation. Whether it was his iconic "You're fired" on The Apprentice or the endless stream of degrading nicknames like Crooked Hillary on Twitter, to personal insults aimed at the appearance of Ted Cruz's wife, shaming wasn't just his brand, it was his power move. These moments weren't just about the targets. They were a warning to everyone watching: loyalty is rewarded and dissent is punished. In an article in Psychology Today titled "Trump is Gaslighting America Again," we see this is a tactic popular with the 45th and 47th US president. Calling Russian intervention in the 2016 presidential election fake news after intelligence agencies have proven it beyond doubt, and claiming to have a record-breaking crowd size at his inauguration are just two examples that immediately come to mind, although at least a dozen more have been documented. Shaming isolates. It silences and it locks people into a cycle of dependence on the very group or leader holding them captive. But isolation doesn't stop there. Whether it's physical separation, emotional manipulation, or simply keeping people too busy to think, isolation is the cornerstone of control. Strip someone of their freedom, cut them off from outside perspectives, and they'll cling tighter to the group for survival. And we're in an epidemic of loneliness. A 2018 Pew Research study revealed that 1 in 10 Americans feels lonely most of the time. Then came the pandemic, which took that already fragile thread of connection and snapped it into. Okay, this quote we already used up there. Ow! I'm going to have to rephrase it. Your ability to communicate atrophies after living in an environment where everyone thinks and acts alike. Cults know this. They don't just isolate you physically, they isolate your thoughts. They reshape how you think, what you believe, and even how you talk about the world. Language in the hands of a high control group becomes a weapon. Cults invent their own jargon, a secret vocabulary that not only cuts members off from the outside world, but also cements an us versus them mentality. Words shape our worlds, and reclaiming your voice is often the first step to breaking free. Breaking free. Let's explore language together. Boom. Next chapter. Language. And that is a 36-page chapter of a book that needs to be 20 pages. So I could tell some parts that sounded repetitive as I was reading aloud, but mostly I'm not great at editing because I think all of my words are brilliant, which is why I pay other people very well to edit my things. I just completely screwed this up. Apparently, even when you have more experience knitting than Jesus had alive, you can still mess up, especially on interchangeable needles. You just sit there waiting to screw you over. Yeah, the repetitive is good. And that's definitely like, in college papers, the whole formula is say what you're going to say it, and then say what you said. I think maybe like there's kind of a conclusion at the end of each of these sections, like maybe just deleting all of those would work, and then it will run more smoothly. But also, she's good at like taming down ADHD brain and just figuring out what has to be said. So interchangeable needles. So I can unscrew this top part and put a different size needle on here. So like thinner or wider, which is great because you have a whole pack of needles and they just go on these things. But it's bad because they like the process of knitting, you're twisting the needles so they unscrew, and then sometimes you really mess things up like I just did. But it's okay because you're not good at knitting when you know how to knit. You're good at knitting when you know how to fix your mistakes. What did we think about the chapter, YouTube friends? Nothing's going to get like cut. Like she's just going to make it better. This is the same woman that helped me write and sell Uncultured, one of them. So like we like her. We like her writing. If we like Uncultured. So just so y'all know. This is someone I've worked with before and I very much trust. And though she did tell me that maybe I rely too heavily on children of God and military examples. And I'm like, but that's my whole thing. But it's okay. one of the things about me is I hire experts and then I listen to them. And that's how I create books that get mentioned twice in the New York Times. So she's good. But yeah, so basically someone was asking when it comes out. So like if I can basically do a chapter a week in editing, and as we just saw, these are quite long, intensive chapters, and that means we can get like the whole text done by March, then hopefully the book will come out in November. And we'll have like nice season leading up to holidays to get it to everyone. So that's the plan. However, if I can't do it, it's because I'm so busy here talking to y'all about the actual culting of America that I'm too busy to do the book and then like making the products and doing the lives and selling the other books. So then I feel like I must be forgiven for taking a long time on this book. Yeah, I mean, I bring in all these big cults. Like this was just one chapter. Like a lot of them are mentioned, but it's like I just focus on everything has cults or Children of God, everything has army, and then I try to focus on other ones. Like when I was just talking about name changes, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm gonna put the Marine thing in there, so it gives it a little different information. And honestly, one of the reasons I rely so heavily on Children of God and Army examples is because then I don't have to cite them. I'm just expecting you to trust me on my own recognizance. If you're not a bro, if you are a bro, I will just cackle at you and proceed to not have to prove myself. Oh yeah, now we'll show you all the outfit, and then I must go. It's time for me to be done working. I'm a whole day ahead on chapter 5. All right. So exactly. Okay. So I got this in New York because now when I travel, like my souvenirs is just a scarf for me to make a scarf again out of. So usually I would take the scarf, I would cut it in half, and then I would cut one half down the middle. And so it would be open. But I cut this and it just immediately started to disintegrate. And I was like, whoa. So it got surrounded in fuzzy so that you can't see that it's falling apart. And then I just made it like a tunic. And of course, it's reversible. So you could wear it like either way. And I think it definitely looks like the guard of the Queen of Hearts, the playing cards. So as we know, or maybe we don't know, I'm obsessed with Alice in Wonderland, as many cult survivors are, because cult survivors have described both the process of joining cults and leaving cults as falling down the rabbit hole. I personally also have a kind of rare migraine disorder called Alice in Wonderland migraines, and it is exactly what it sounds like. So we are very Alice obsessed here in this house. But anyways, I made this and I was like, okay, is it ridiculous or is it high fash? And I've gotten more compliments on this today than in like almost anything I wear other than the sparkly spacesuit or that one peacock necklace. So we're going with high fash. All right. Thanks, everybody. Back tomorrow. If you are interested in being a part of investing in the book, the link is in the bio for the GoFundMe, or buying a signed copy of Uncultured is kind of going to that as well. So with